In past lectures, we have talked about how America from the 1930s and the New Deal up through the Great Society of the 1960s had turned a liberal corner in the sense that Americans had increasingly by the 1960s come to accept and expect in some cases that when there was a need, the federal government would step in and provide various services, whether that had to do with civil rights, whether that had to do with fixing the economy, whatever. Americans by the 1960s had come to expect it. But what we begin to see during this period is growing calls for civil rights for African Americans, rights for women. And this rights movement, this rights revolution, if you will, started to lead some Americans to feel that perhaps things had become too big in terms of the role of government in society. And as a result of that, as you can see the heading of this lecture, you had a backlash in America, a conservative backlash from people who were criticizing two things. First of all, the size of government, and secondly, the growing calls among all these special interest groups, again, the women, the African Americans, and various other groups for government assistance. So that is what we are going to deal with in today's lecture here, talking about that conservative backlash, and at the same time showing how it actually originated within the Democratic Party itself, and it would move through some of the domestic problems that lead to further calls for making America conservative rather than liberal. So I want to begin the story, like I alluded to just a second ago, by talking about the Democratic Party itself during the 1960s, because what begins to take place is that we see an implosion occurring within the Democratic Party. And a lot of that had to do with this idea, as I have the heading at the top of this slide, the two faces of the Democratic Party. And we're going to tell one piece of this story. We would tell various parts of it, but we're going to focus on one individual to tell about this implosion of the Democratic Party. And that individual is the man that we see on the left hand of the screen with the Confederate flag in the background. And that man that we see on the left hand of the screen is the Democratic governor of the state of Alabama, George Wallace. When George Wallace took the oath of office to become governor of Alabama in January of 1963, he stood on a gold star. And this gold star marked the exact spot where more than 100 years earlier, Jefferson Davis was sworn in as the President of the Confederate States of America, and thus began the Civil War. Well, during his inaugural address, Wallace, again a Democrat, said the following thing that we see on the screen. "In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth," Wallace said, "I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny. And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." So what we see in the person of Wallace is this group of white Southern Democrats. I referred to them in our lecture on civil rights. These white Southern Democrats in Congress at this time were strongly opposed to civil rights legislation. Well, here we have really the face of that segregationist movement in the South, George Wallace. And in fact, George Wallace kept his promise of segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. At least the first part of that, segregation now. How did he do that? Well, in June of 1963, Wallace refused to allow two African American students to enroll at the University of Alabama. In fact, it went beyond words, because what the governor did was he actually stood in the entrance to one of the university buildings and gave a speech on states' rights, therefore personally defying the court orders for desegregation. Well, in response to this blatant disregard for federal laws, President John F. Kennedy sent federal troops to force Wallace to allow the two African American students into the University of Alabama. But nonetheless, more and more throughout 1963, George Wallace would become one of the most recognized faces of segregation in America. So therefore, not surprisingly, really more so to promote this idea of states' rights, George Wallace would throw his hat into the 1964 presidential election for the Democratic nomination. And in doing so, of course, in 1964, he would be running against the incumbent, the current president of the United States, Lyndon Johnson. Well, as we already know, Johnson spoke in favor of the Civil Rights Act and other pieces of civil rights legislation. Wallace, conversely, and on the other hand, campaigned against civil rights, appealing to white resentment over the protest of African Americans, but not only over these protests, but also the government's attention to their grievances, often at the expense of whites. At least that's what a lot of white Americans were thinking during this time. Well, Wallace would campaign using overtly racist rhetoric. And in fact, Wallace would fare quite well in the supposedly integrated North. Where did he find a lot of his support? Here in the integrated North of the United States, particularly among white ethnic blue-collar workers. Now, these white ethnic blue-collar workers had been Democrats really since the 1930s as a result of the New Deal programs that allowed workers to unionize in the 1930s. So where do we see this success? Well, for instance, George Wallace would win 30% of the vote in Wisconsin. He would also win 30% of the vote in Indiana. So these two primaries were very good to George Wallace. But even greater success was found in the state of Maryland, where in that primary, George Wallace won 43% of the popular vote. Now, in none of these states, Wisconsin, Indiana, or Maryland, did George Wallace defeat the incumbent Lyndon Johnson. But nonetheless, winning nearly a third or more of the vote in these primaries showed that there were a lot of Americans, particularly, again, these white ethnic blue-collar workers, who were upset with the progress being made among African Americans with their civil rights. Well, despite these successes, Wallace would eventually drop out of the race. Nonetheless, Lyndon Johnson soon realized the ramifications for the Democrats' support of the Civil Rights Act, which was passed and signed in July of 1964. Because as the story goes, after he signed the bill on July 2nd of 1964, he said the following to an aide close by. And you can see this quote on the screen: "We," meaning the Democrats, "have lost the South for a generation." And in fact, you can begin to see that already here in the 1964 presidential election. In 1964, Lyndon Johnson ran against a senator, Republican senator from the state of Arizona, Barry Goldwater, who was one of the few senators to vote against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Well, here we have a pretty clear portrait. It's a landslide victory in 1964 for Lyndon Johnson. But pay close attention to what states and what region of the country were not won by Lyndon Johnson. Now, Arizona, not surprisingly, being the home state of Barry Goldwater, went to Barry Goldwater. But Barry Goldwater, in this landslide loss to Lyndon Johnson, also would win the Deep South states of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. And like I referred to earlier, this would be a precursor to a dramatic reversal where you are now going to see from 1964 on non-Democrats winning in the South. And in fact, you do see that in the 1968 election, the next election after 1964, of course. Here is a little more confusing picture, because what happens in 1968, is you actually have three candidates running. You have, from the Democratic side, Hubert Humphrey. Remember we talked about in the Vietnam lecture that Lyndon Johnson would actually not run again for re-election in 1968, so he is replaced by his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, running as a Democrat. The Republicans will come about to nominate Richard Nixon, who we'll talk about more so in a little while here. But then we also have a third party, the American Independent Party, led by George Wallace, who will actually move outside of the Democratic Party and seek election as a third-party candidate. So let's take a look at this map from 1968, because what we see again is the Democrats losing not only the election itself, this time the Republican Richard Nixon will win the 1968 presidential election, but we also see the South going to someone other than a Democratic candidate. And that someone else is George Wallace, running as his third-party candidate, winning the states of Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. Now, what I want you to also pay attention to in this picture is the domination of Richard Nixon in a lot of solidly Democratic states. So, for instance, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, blue-collar states. Now, even though Richard Nixon won these, he did not win a big chunk of the white ethnic working class votes. So therefore, as we'll see in the next slide, that is what Nixon wants to go after to really solidify his electoral strength as he is thinking about the 1972 election. So as I mentioned, I want to talk a little bit here about Richard Nixon and his approach to trying to win those white ethnic blue-collar workers that were so supportive, particularly of George Wallace's campaigns in 1964 and 1968. And I want to start here with Richard Nixon as he stood before the throng of supporters at the Republican National Convention in Miami in August 1968. So now he was the nominated candidate to run for the presidency for the Republican Party. And during his acceptance speech here in August of 1968, the candidate promised to speak for those voters attracted to Wallace, but he did so in a less overtly racist manner. And we see that in this long quote on the left side of the screen. So I apologize for the length of this. Normally in a face-to-face class, I would actually listen to this class and we discuss it a little, but I wanted to pick out this one piece because it really gets at something that is a key component of Nixon's strategy in winning these white ethnic, blue-collar workers. He said the following: "As we look at America, we see cities enveloped in smoke and flame. We hear sirens in the night. We see Americans dying on distant battlefields abroad. We see Americans hating each other, fighting each other, killing each other at home. And as we see and hear these things, millions of Americans cry out in anguish. Did we come all this way for this? Did American boys die in Normandy, in Korea, and in Valley Forge for this? Listen to the answer to those questions. It is another voice. It is the quiet voice in the tumult and the shouting. It is the voice of the great majority of Americans, the forgotten Americans, the non-shouters, the non-demonstrators. They are not racist or sick. They are not guilty of the crime that plagues the land. They are black and they are white. They're native-born and foreign-born. They're young and they're old. They work in America's factories. They run America's businesses. They serve in government. They provide most of the soldiers who died to keep us free. They give drive to the spirit of America. They give lift to the American dream. They give steel to the backbone of America. They are good people. They are decent people. They work and they save and they pay their taxes and they care." Now, like I said, I wanted to spend some time on this quote because it really gets at the heart of this idea of Nixon's silent majority. These are the people, the quiet voice in the tumult and the shouting, as Nixon described them, who are not the civil rights activists, who are not the anti-war activists out on the streets protesting. They are the forgotten Americans, the hard workers, the ones who go to work every day, who save and pay taxes. But at the same time, listen to that language, the forgotten Americans. This is very much a throwback to William Graham Sumner document that we talked about earlier in the semester about the forgotten man. How basically the hard worker is being forgotten by the government and being cast aside as the government puts all this praise on these African Americans, these students, these women. But here's the other thing, that one other part of this quote that I think is worth reiterating. He talks about them as not being racist or sick. and that they are black and white. So this is clearly an effort here by Richard Nixon to keep that race card sort of under cover, if you will, by focusing on this silent majority and pushing aside that more racist segment of George Wallace's rhetoric. But nonetheless, here's the problem that Richard Nixon faced. Most working class voters feared that a Republican administration would do away with the popular New Deal programs that benefited them. So we're talking about things like Social Security, like the Wagner Act of 1935 that allowed and protected collective bargaining unions. So thus, we will find, as we just saw on the map prior to this slide, in 1968, Nixon failed to win these voters. Why? Because most of them still went to George Wallace. Well, nonetheless, we are going to see a change here. Failure in 1968 to success in 1972. And to begin this story, I want to look at something that appeared in New York Magazine in 1969. And that was Pete Hamill's piece, The Revolt of the White Lower Middle Class. So this article confirmed Nixon's belief that Northern working class voters voted for Wallace in 1968 less because of the racist attitudes of these people than a feeling that they were not respected and that the government had ignored their concerns and paid more attention to African Americans, student protesters, and women. So Nixon would read this article closely in 1969, and he would give it to his strategist to devise a strategy for the 1972 election. Was it successful? Well, as you can see on the screen, in the 1972 election, 70% of the white working class in America voted for Richard Nixon in 1972. To continue this story of backlash among conservatives, I want to move outside of politics in the sense that I want to focus on feminism's adversary. And that is the woman that we see on the right, Phyllis Schlafly, who, interestingly enough, in popular culture of recent times, has become a topic of conversation again due to a series known as Mrs. America, where her story is told. And her story is a unique one. She was Phyllis Schlafly, was born into a wealthy Roman Catholic family in St. Louis. She would serve as president of the Illinois Federation of Republican Women in 1964 when she published a book. And this book was titled A Choice, Not an Echo. And this book would sell over 3.5 million copies. So this was really a success story for this woman, Phyllis Schlafly. Now the book derided what she called these kingmakers. These kingmakers were those liberal Republicans from the East Coast who ignored, in her mind, the true conservatives that were prominent in the West Coast. People like Ronald Reagan, the upcoming governor of California, and also the presidential candidate in 1964, Barry Goldwater. But it wasn't really until 1972 that Phyllis Schlafly really picked up momentum and gained a certain bit of national notoriety. And that notoriety came as a result of her efforts to stop passage and ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA. So this Equal Rights Amendment had a long history. It was actually first introduced in Congress way back in the early 1920s. And though Congress failed to pass the amendment for the next half century, for the next 50 years or so, Republicans and Democrats offered their support for the constitutional amendment. And this constitutional amendment would simply have guaranteed equal rights for women, saying whatever is in the Constitution is a right for all Americans, including women. However, we finally start to see momentum changing in the early 1970s, after, in part, the emergence of the women's liberation movement. We would see Congress approve the amendment in 1972, and this meant that the issue would now be turned over to the states for ratification. So the states would have 7 years to ratify the amendment, and it would take three-fourths of the states to ratify the amendment for it to become part of the U.S. Constitution. Now, early on, you would actually find widespread bipartisan support. For instance, Republican President Gerald Ford supported ratification, as did his wife, Betty Ford. Betty Ford, in fact, would attend pro-ERA rallies and spoke at rallies in support of candidates in the 1972 and 1974 elections who were supportive of the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. So here we are moving through and we see some success. Within 1 year, 24 states had ratified the convention. And here we see, at the same time, despite this tremendous early success, the momentum dying almost immediately as well. And that was due largely to Phyllis Schlafly's organization, Stop ERA. Now, Stop ERA was actually an acronym, and that acronym stood for the following: Stop Taking Our Privileges. By 1973, Stop ERA organizations were active in 26 states, mostly in those that had yet to ratify the amendment. So you have to ask yourself the question, why did this woman, Phyllis Schlafly, oppose an amendment that would seem to benefit and her fellow sisters, if you will, in the women's rights movement, but also women in general across the United States? Well, Phyllis Schlafly argued that ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment would result in women being drafted into the military, allowing for abortion on demand, allow for same-sex marriage, and also, and finally, the last point, loss of legal protections for wives, mothers, and female workers. In short, what we see and what you see in the document is Phyllis Schlafly is content with women remaining subservient to men and maintaining and preserving their roles as homemakers. So here's the thing. As the Stop ERA movement is clashing with women's rights organizations like the National Organization for Women, by 1977, 35 states had ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. This meant that only 3 additional states had to ratify the amendment for it to pass. So in spite of Stop ERA, it looks like perhaps, just perhaps, the Equal Rights Amendment may indeed be ratified. But even with the deadline to ratify extended to 1982, no more states would ratify the amendment, and in fact some even reversed course and rescinded their earlier ratification. So therefore, up until the present day, there is no amendment in the Constitution guaranteeing equal rights for women in the United States. So what I want to do here with the rest of the lecture is move away from this conservative backlash and set the groundwork, set the background, lay the background, if you will, for Ronald Reagan's eventual rise to the presidency in the 1980s. And to do that, we need to talk about the economic deterioration of the United States in the 1970s. And we're going to begin here with this long list that we see in this slide of terrible statistics that show America going downhill in the 1970s. So in short, what we see is that American century that we talked about earlier in the semester now coming to an end by 1973 for certain. And we see this at unemployment, the changes in unemployment. In 1964, the unemployment was at a completely low number of 3.4%. Well, by the end of 1970, however, unemployment would nearly double to 6.1%, and by the mid-1970s, by 1975, unemployment would reach 8.5%. So as all of this is going on, we would see a similar change occurring in relation to inflation. Inflation rates remained steady in the first half of the 1960s. From 1960 to 1965, it would hover around 1 and 1.5%. However, by 1970, inflation reached 6%. So as a result of this, you might say, well, who cares? What does inflation mean for everyday, ordinary Americans? Well, by 1974, retail prices would rise by 11%. So therefore, everything Americans were buying was now costing more. and therefore their paychecks were not going up equally, and they were having trouble pay for this. So as a result, we see gross national product falling by mid-1970s by 2%. The following year, in 1975, as I alluded to earlier, unemployment would reach a post-war high, post-World War II high of 8.5%, and the GNP, the gross national product, would fall another 3%. So things are just bad all around. So therefore, economists are looking for a way to describe these conditions. So therefore, in the early 1970s, an economist, a guy by the name of Arthur Occam, created what was known as the Misery Index. The Misery Index provided a numerical account of the combined rates of unemployment and inflation. Now, when we look at the numbers using this Misery Index, you can see just how bad it was in 1970s America. The index, the Misery Index, would reach 17% by 1975 and eventually rise to 21% in 1980. And what made this so mind-boggling and confusing for U.S. politicians and economists was the fact that inflation and unemployment usually did not go up together. So this combination of growing inflation and unemployment, therefore, would become known as stagflation, and it would really become a symbol of 1970s America. And as you can see on the image of the right, Americans are just scratching their heads. They are finding their dollar bills in their pockets and in their paychecks just not being worth as much because of that inflationary spiral that was a major aspect of stagflation in the 1970s. To explain these economic indicators that we described in the last slide, we need to understand what is going on in America in the 1970s. And what is going on in the 1970s is an urban crisis. And this urban crisis is a result of deindustrialization, the moving away of factories from a lot of these urban centers, either to the south of the United States or abroad. And we see a hugely important statistic in 1971, and that is the following. In 1971, the United States would become a net importer of foreign goods for the first time since the late 19th century. This is a huge change because now American products are no longer American-made products. Americans are now purchasing more and more foreign goods produced abroad. Well, the thing is, while America opened its borders to products from Japan and West Germany in the early 1970s, these nations maintained trade barriers that protected their domestic markets from foreign competition. Well, as a result of this foreign competition from Germany, Japan, and other Asian nations, fewer and fewer Americans were working in factories. And I can give you a long list of all these different products, but I want to focus on one, a main driver of economic growth in the United States for much of the 20th century, and that is automobiles. In the auto industry alone, the number of workers went from 760,000 in 1978, falling to 490,000 in 1981. And here's the thing, the manufacturing jobs that did remain in America were increasingly low paid, and they were increasingly in the Sun Belt region of the United States, the South and the Southwest. Why? Because in that South Sun Belt region, we would see companies locating there due to lower taxes, anti-union laws. And therefore, we see the emergence in the Midwest and the Northeast of this Rust Belt, which is given that name because you have all these old, dilapidated factories that are rusting and no longer in use because now all the manufacturing either takes place in the Sun Belt in the southern United States or southwestern United States or foreign companies abroad. I want to focus on one city in particular that really felt the brunt of this deindustrialization. Now, you could definitely talk about Detroit, but I want to focus on New York City, which during the 1970s was just a disaster zone. So much so that some people took to calling it Fear City as one of the documents that you read for today's class. So I want to talk about 1971, or excuse me, the early 1970s, because what you see is as these economic conditions worsened, Midwestern and Northeastern cities became known as this Rust Belt. And New York City really epitomized the situation for many American cities in the North. So I want to give you some more statistics here, and I'm less concerned with the exact numbers than what they show. So consider that as we're going through a lot of these numbers. From the mid-1960s through the mid-1970s, the city of New York lost 600,000 jobs. By 1974, the city's unemployment rate was at 7%. Now here's the thing, and this is what I want you to think about. As these jobs left the city, so too did a lot of whites, known as white flight, but also a lot of middle-class African Americans. So therefore, by 1970, more than 20% of New Yorkers were black, while another 16% were Puerto Rican. But it wasn't just the race or ethnicity of these people who were left behind. It was also the fact that the ones who were left behind were the neediest people, requiring the most public assistance. And we can see this again in terms of one of the biggest means of public, or biggest examples of public assistance, welfare. The number of people in New York City receiving welfare rose from 322,921 in 1960 to just over 1.2 million in 1972. So not only is the city now having to pay for more welfare, but it also has to deal with more crime. As you have people unemployed, they're more likely to partake in illegal activities. But the only problem is, and you see reference to this in your document, Fear City, there is not enough money in the budget of New York City to pay for police officers. And this gets to another importance of that white flight and the leaving of the black middle class, because what these individual families are taking with them, and even the corporation, the industry that are leaving New York City are taking with them, of course, is tax money. So therefore, without this tax money and with paying more to welfare, the city of New York has to cut back on certain things. And one of those things is policing. So as a result of this, we see a dramatic jump in crime. By 1973, there were 1,680 homicides. There were also, in addition to that, in 1974 alone, 4,054 rapes. 1974 again, assaults 41,068, and burglaries 158,321. But it wasn't just public assistance that was becoming a problem. It wasn't just rising crime. It was also the image that we see on the right, and that is crumbling infrastructure. So this picture that we see on the right comes from late 1973. And in late 1973, a cement truck was driving along West Side Highway to repair another portion of this main thoroughway around New York City. If any of you have ever been to New York City, you'll know that there's this kind of thoroughway around the boundary of Manhattan Island. West Side Highway is obviously on the west side of that highway, so a major drive-through. Well, here we are in late 1973, and this cement truck is driving through, and as you can see on the image on the right, the road collapses underneath him. Now, the cement truck driver was fine, but we would see now this major thoroughway through New York City needing a repair. Well, when the city looked at the repairs needed, it was determined that they would cost about $88 million. The city could not afford this $88 million, so therefore demolition of this deconstructed area did not begin until about 3 years later in 1977, and construction would not be finished on the West Side Highway until 1989. So clearly this is a problem, and this just shows you the dire need of a lot of these cities. And you see this a lot of times in a lot of the films during this time. If any of you have ever watched Taxi Driver, That's an example of some of the grime that goes on during this time. Another good example is, I'm thinking of some of the other ones. We'll just stick with the taxi driver example, but there's just tons of them in the 1970s that were produced showing this grime and dirt of New York City. So by 1974, New York City was $10 billion in debt, and the following year it would actually face bankruptcy. So therefore, as states have to do when they do not have money because they cannot run budget deficits, they had to go to the federal government to seek aid in order for their city to survive. So therefore, they went to the Republican president, Gerald Ford. Now, President Ford famously denied federal aid to the city. You can see this on the Daily News front page here from 1975. Ford to city, drop dead. Vows he'll veto any bailout. Now, he didn't use those exact words of drop dead, but the New Yorkers got the point. Now, President Ford charged that the city of New York had brought its problems on itself. President Ford ignored this exodus that we've been talking about of corporations, of industry, of white and black middle class, because rather what President Ford focused on was what in his mind was the lavish social welfare programs and other benefits provided to New Yorkers. One of the things that he really was angry about was that if you were a resident of New York City, you could get free tuition at the City College of New York. So that was one thing that Gerald Ford really railed against. So eventually there's concern, particularly among big economic corporations within New York City, saying that this would be detrimental not only to New York City, but also to the country if New York City declares bankruptcy. So therefore, Gerald Ford started talking to Alan Greenspan. Alan Greenspan would be a future chairman of the Federal Reserve, but in the 1970s, under Gerald Ford, he was then his Council of Economic Advisors, the head of his Council of Economic Advisors. And Alan Greenspan advised the president to reject New York City's pleas in order to force the city to achieve, in his words, in Greenspan's words, fiscal responsibility. So therefore, at least immediately, the federal funds would not be funneled to New York. So therefore, New York had to cut social services, municipal services, including laying off thousands of police officers. So nonetheless, eventually Gerald Ford would bow to the pressure of these economic corporations with headquarters in New York City. But here's the kind of point connected to this. Gerald Ford had one major string attached. New York City could get federal bailout money only if it strove for balanced budgets. And therefore, in order to achieve these balanced budgets, it had to cut social services. So what we see in New York City, like I said, is a microcosm of what is happening across America during this time. Calls for less government, this time at the city level, but nonetheless a shrinking of the government, a conservative ideal that is very obvious here in this struggle for New York City in the mid-1970s.